Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs les ambassadeurs, Mesdames et Messieurs.
Your Excellencies, dear ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight I will talk to you about France in the world, about France the way she is and about her aspiration in today's world. I will tell you about the place she currently holds and the one that she should hold, about the role she once had and the one I will give her back. I will talk to you about the policy I will lead with regards to international relations, peace and safety. In this dangerous world, France must fulfill her role in order to reinstate dialogue between all nations, to ease growing tensions and prevent wars, which could lead to possibly destructive results. From this perspective, she must engage in initiatives based on her history, her independence and her influence. She must assume to undertake. Above all, I will talk about what is most important in my eyes, what France has to offer to the world, because she is France and because we are French. France's foreign policy is based on reality, our world as it is. Not the world as I would like it to be, France as she is, and not as I would like her to be. This is the starting point for everything else. Words, ideas and speeches disguising reality do not change the facts we're faced with, imposed brutally upon us, even more so to those who try to ignore them. Denial of reality carries a great cost. The weakening of France and the diminishing of her positions in the world all originate from a refusal to admit reality. Reality is replaced by general ideas, manufactured emotions and double-standard moralization. I refuse to withdraw. I refuse alignment. This is why I will first and foremost tell the government in charge of France's foreign policy to take reality into account again. Taking reality into account again also means being able to rise and detect the fundamental changes that we are confronted with. In a time when a certain political class tries to limit the analysis of the migration issue to compassion, I say it is irresponsible not to see these large population movements as a major geographical issue and even, in some cases, a threat to the world's peace and the equilibrium. No continent is spared by these migratory movements. No country can pretend to be indifferent, either because its elites are fleeing or because it's victim to the metropolization of its rural population in urban gatherings, beyond human comprehension, or because it is on the route of migratory movements to the point of being destabilized, or because it is forced into managing global misery without necessarily having the means to do so. Knowledge in order to undertake and to take action. This is the essential requirement to enable France to take back its position in the strategic debate, which she has unfortunately forfeited. It is the requirement for the national strategy of peace, influence and power that I ask my government to conduct. Reality always imposes itself sooner or later, and the later it comes, the more painful it is. The illusion of power can lead to the worst mistakes when it leads to ignoring failures and errors. The Iraq invasion and the dissolution of the Iraqi army were a mistake, accentuated by the US Army's hasty withdrawal. Support for moderate Islamists in Syria was and remains a mistake. These errors and mistakes have a common background, the denial of real forces at work, which are the forces of history, ideas, ideologies, religions and origins. These mistakes of interpretation have a grave explanation. The fake naivety which pretends we live in a binary world vision, dividing world between friends and enemies, making the enemies of our enemies our friends and therefore allies. Against the regime of Bashar al-Assad, Western powers were seen helping Islamist forces who fight for Wahhabist theocracy. Should Russians not remember the plundering of their country's resources, organized by young consultants fresh out of the Chicago school in the late 1990s, with their accomplices within the Boris Yeltsin inner circle? And how can we ignore that the British Parliament's report on the responsibilities in the Iraqi invasion puts ignorance of reality and territorial misreadings at the forefront? In foreign policy as well, facts are obstinate.
La franchise est une marque de
Truthfulness
respect.
is a mark of respect.
Par exemple,
For instance,
les mensonges qui ont entouré
the lies
l'ouverture
surrounding the
processus d'adhésion de la
Turkey's
Turquie
UA
contre
membership
la
process,
volonté manifeste
against the
de la
obvious will of the majority of
Européens,
Europeans,
prouvent leur
find an
équivalent
equivalent
dans les
in the
mensonges
lies
et
and
les faux
subterfuges
semblants
surrounding
qui ont
the
entouré les
negotiations
négociations sur le
on the
traité de libre-échange avec
EU-Canada
le
Free
Canada,
Trade
qui a
Agreement,
été conclu
which
grâce
was
à un
concluded
artifice
thanks to an
institutionnel
institutional
contre
trick
la
used against the
des
position of
pays
European
européens,
people.
des peuples européens. Il sera
It will inevitably
inévitablement
be
remis en cause.
reconsidered. I have the
Moi, j'ai
honesty
la
to say
franchise
it.
de le dire. Tout cela n'est pas digne de la France.
All this is not worthy of
Tout
France.
cela fait flotter sur l'Union un air de trahison.
All this shrouds the Union in a cloak of treason and lacks respect towards great nations such as Turkey and Canada. I want to improve the quality of France's international relations with these countries, like with so many others, and honesty and openness will play a great part in this necessary improvement. Respect for reality means seeing the world as it is in its diversity and not seeing the world throughout an outdated Western-centered prism. People have an identity, they have a history, they have a culture, and they pursue their national interests as they see it at a given moment, in a given situation. Some people regret this. I am delighted by this. Furthermore, a measured look at history demonstrates the consistency of the soul of a people. This highlights that people pursue the same goal over centuries, that they are often haunted by the same political passions, although their expression may change or evolve. It was not a Brexiter who once said, "If Britain must choose between Europe and the open sea, she must always choose the open sea." No. It was Winston Churchill. Under changing titles and names, throughout different political regimes, the soul of a people always rises. Invariably, some given facts never change. People always express their passion to remain who they are, to decide their own destiny, to choose their allies, to pass down their culture. Look at Turkey, taking back her historic role as a leader of Sunni Islam. Look at Iran, inexhaustibly asserting herself as a regional power. Look at the Sahel, where the age-old conflict between nomads and sedentaries is going on. Look at India, how she affirms herself in thousands-year-old culture with incredible economic development on the path of modernization. This country, which englobes 1/6 of humanity, knows how to maintain a sustainable growth whilst respecting herself. This example should lead to reflection. Experience shows that continuity, even consistency, shape long-term history, and one needs to be able to step back, to take distance, to distinguish, muffled by surrounding grey noise, the sense of history unfolding itself. The singularity of people in the world are not necessarily soluble in a single market economy. Those who believe that commodization will win over particularisms in a great movement of planned cultural standardization are simply ignorant of the soul of people. No more do singularities fade away when enticed by solemn declaration or intimidation by great powers. Our values, to which we feel legitimately attached, are not those of Asia, Africa, or the Russian world. Claiming to impose them by money, influence, or even worse, by force, only results in arousing the fire of violence based on feelings of humiliation and resentment. We are living in a world in which people, freed of communist illusions as well as from the lies of financial liberalism and globalization, feel disappointment today in the same measure of their former hopes. They are looking for a way out and find in a nation-state a way to serve their interests. The political vision I defend for my country relies on the persistence of unicultural nation. That is to say, a nation united by its culture, regardless of the background of those who compose it. This right to our own culture that I demand for France, this right I recognize for all people, brings me to defend a multicultural conception of the world. So you can see, I do not wish to promote any kind of French or Western model. I do not wish to promote any system which could claim a universal value, but on the contrary, I wish to promote respect for different cultures and respect for the freedom of people. I hold the conviction that the abundant diversity of cultures derives from this superior vision of civilization, and that this conception is the greatest French contribution to the world's civilization. France must respect the nations and people of equal dignity, that she intends to protect their integrity, their singularity and their sovereignty, just like she intends to protect her own singularity. National differences are the most universal of political passions, promoting non-interference. State sovereignty and each nation's political freedom is the way to true universalism. That of differences, of cultures and of civilizations which cannot exist if they are not plural and diverse, and which globalization transforms into touristic caricatures, a mercantile mockery. In this logic, we intend to revive our country's millenary diplomatic action. Diplomacy of a great power, considered and respected because she is respectful. Diplomacy whose prestige used to make France a reference in the world. As a head of state, I will base our diplomacy on two pillars: independence and equilibrium, with the aim of defending our vital interests. Independence, because the bipolar reasoning engages from a spirit of clash, and the world, especially non-aligned, is waiting for a country to hold the voice of a multipolar vision. This independence policy will be based in every situation on a global strategy, a clear vision of what we stand for and what we fight against. We will be able to identify and designate the main enemy, he who harms the integrity of our territory, he who threatens the nation's identity, the unity of French people, he who attempts to subject us to his laws, his custom, his interest. We have paid the high price of war, oh yes, but we also suffered for an occupation. We saw combatants of France being shot, and we learned what had been taking place in the death camps. We owe it to ourselves, as well as to the world, to remind everyone that there exists something worse than war. This is national humiliation. That is the invasion of one's territory. That is the submission of people to laws, principles, and violent disputes which are not their own. If the era of shame, invasion and slavery was to come back, France should be the first to rise to tell the world there is no sacrifice too great, no struggle too fierce, no resistance too great to eradicate humiliation, invasion and slavery. Today, I want to tell you that to guarantee the independence of France and the freedom of its people, the price can never be too high and the struggle not too frightening. In this context, it is clear that France's decisions are made in Paris and that no ally, no treaty, no alliance will ever decide for France in her place. It is just as clear that France takes care herself of the defense of her territory and that she undertakes the necessary and appropriate measures in order to guarantee the security of her territory, of her interests of her citizens, without relying on anyone. It should be clear that no means and no sacrifice will be too great if the independence of our country were to be threatened, and that nuclear deterrence must play its role to preserve our independence should we be faced with anyone trying to submit us. I will ensure that France keeps the means she has, or acquires those she relinquished, all means ensuring her security both within France as well as internationally. I plan to write into the Constitution that the defence budget will be at a minimum of 2% of GDP and will reach 3% at the end of my first term. In the meantime, it should be increased to reach a level that allows the autonomy of our national defence, the progress of our nuclear component, and enable the deployment of our troops in foreign areas from which our enemies are attacking us. I tell you this with serene resolution. The danger France faces comes from the feeble-mindedness of its leaders. Aside from that, we have every means of responding to attacks, to secure our borders and to defend French citizens everywhere in the world. It just takes the will to act and acquire the means to do so. In particular, it is sufficient to let everyone know that any organization who threatens French interests, who intimidates French citizens, or who attacks physically will be treated as an enemy of France. This independence that I claim for my country also requires the principle of non-interventionism into the affairs of other countries. Every country has the legitimate right of self-determination. We will break with moralizing diplomacy, which is based on some form of colonial nostalgia that we do not share. The second pillar of our policy will be the balance of power. The balance of power, The counterweight is justified because it is not France's role to take sides for either one or other great power, to support one country at war against another, neither to support a religious movement against another. We will impose upon ourselves to be fair but firm, to be measured but attentive, to be powerful in order to be reassuring, with the aim of finding together the paths towards dialogue and peace. For people around the world, France is destined to be a nation that reaches out, a nation that lends a hand to the oppressed people, a nation that speaks for the voiceless, a nation which carries something strong and great. France also has to be great to help the others. As such, we will serve national interest, our sole guide in our political and our diplomatic action. Emotional politics are too often the politics rooted with confusion, politics that react rather than act. I will fight against fear. I have never accepted to let fear dictate my actions. I will never let France's policies be guided by fear. I intend to replace fear by confidence and security for every French citizen, not by vague, discoordinated proclamations, but by policies, actions and force when needed. This is why France's policies will be guided by peace, military strength and strategic power. I will spare no means to protect the integrity of our homeland and the identity of our nation and the independence of France, which are the highest common goods for every French citizen. This way, French people will have a serene relationship with the rest of the world, which will allow the government to benefit from more efficiency and freedom of action. At last, servicing justice and law. Rising tensions and war in some places of the world, especially around the Mediterranean Sea, probably come from double standards practiced by great powers who instrument law, international institutions and parastatal organizations. Look at the international summits, who pretend to rule the world and whose leaders represent less than a fifth of humanity. The care for law and justice is one of France's distinctive characteristics. This is what makes France both unique and universal. The will to defend our independence as the most important objective of our foreign policy is a universal will. Its application would give the world international relations, an international community, international meaning between nations, the core meaning that they have unfortunately lost. We know, as General de Gaulle reminded us, the general who gave back diplomatic power to France after the disaster of the Fourth Republic, that states have no friends, they only have interests. We accept the right of others to promote their own interests, as we intend to defend ours. We state loud and clear that if we have no friends in the sense of this quote, which is quite harsh, we have natural allies thanks to historical and effective links, cultural links, as well as political and strategic agreements. We claim to be allowed to defend our interests, our territorial integrity, our agriculture, which is necessary to our ability to feed our people, the energy required for our domestic and industrial activities, our national defense, our cultural and linguistic prestige, our alliances with other countries. It goes without saying that defending our vital interests can lead us to defend ourselves. The only criteria to determine our domestic and foreign policy will be the security of French citizens, the integrity of our territory, and the independence of our policies. Our interventions in Africa, as well as the lesser-known operations in North Africa and in the Middle East, demonstrate every week the excellence of our armed forces, the loyalty of the French soldier, and the quality of its commanders. These men who serve France deserve to be led differently, to be engaged against a designated enemy and not to have the slightest doubt about the reasons for they are enlisted. They fight and sometimes they die. I will make sure that the French military interventions, should I have to decide any, will never be tainted by doubt about their legitimacy and their purpose. It is necessary to have a clear victory. Because I have observed that France has played a role on its own, or sometimes pushed by others, in conflicts which are not of her concern, for the sake of interests that differed from those of our country and which sometimes were contradictory with the resolutions adopted by the United Nations and with the objectives of peace and protection of civilians. Our intervention in Libya went beyond the UN mandate and the international embargo by giving the so-called moderate Islamic rebels weapons that have ended up among the weapons of ISIS and possibly were used to kill French citizens. The closure of the French embassy in Syria, a territory which for a long time had a French-speaking elite and used to protect Christian minorities, was more than a mistake. How many terror attacks in France could have been avoided by maintaining contacts with the Syrian intelligence services? How many French citizens have paid with their lives the blindness of those that pretended to rule the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs? These policies do not serve the interests of France. It isn't even a policy. We need to ask ourselves, either the French ministers were very badly informed, or in this case, we have to strongly improve our intelligence services and increase their means, or our political leaders have pushed France to serve other interests. They have served foreign interests against the security of the French citizens. This is called high treason. From Afghanistan to Libya, from Serbia to Ukraine, strategic void is our primary enemy. Everybody understands the tragedy lived by the people of Libya, and everybody fears what can happen in the future in the Sahel. On the entire African continent, weapons and Libyan mercenaries can move between countries to find and be deployed. Everybody knows that the Libyan stability was protecting Europe from the flood of Sub-Saharan refugees. Everybody realizes to what point the propaganda was lying about the true nature of the French and British interventions, about the main enemy, about a regime change that was illegitimate and contradictory to France's interests. The same mistake was avoided in Syria. Let us not repeat it. I will not give in to temptation of using weapons to distract the public opinion and using foreign interventions to avoid a debate on domestic policy. We owe it to the French people. For the last 10 years, France has been a warmonger and has believed she could solve problems, political, religious and ethnic issues with war, whereas their complexity ruled out such a simplistic resolution. I do not belong to those who believe that using weapons can end any debate and solve any problem. The temptation of weapons reveals weakness, and too often France has succumbed to this temptation. France did not have a clear home policy. She did not have a strategy to promote her interests and face her challenges. It required weapons to replace one and the other. French soldiers have fought bravely in order to overshadow the failure of those who, when they were governing France, were supposed to defend the integrity of French soil and the union of the nation. I see this as a result of the overwhelming confusion that exists on strategic matters, such as not to name our enemy by its name, to misrepresent the reality of ethnic confrontation in Africa, up to trade off the strategic independence of France against the illusion of a Western alliance and for a military and financial complex in search of enemies in order to justify their revenues. The intellectual and moral disarmament propagated by the nationalized elites are our worst enemy. Again, the tide of history is nation-states, and we will embody the history to come, whereas the denationalized elites stopped at the borders of a globalist illusion in the 20th century. To me, 7 components shall command French policy, including the observation of a long-term history and current realities. These components are obvious. I am not saying that I wish them. I am not saying that France should settle for them or be pleased about them. I am saying that this is how things are and that this observation is the cornerstone of every efficient and realistic national policy. 1. We live in a world of nation states, which is the consequence of parallel trends, of decolonization, which ended in its traditional form in the 1970s, and the decomposition of the Soviet Empire, which was replaced by a community of sovereign states, first by the Commonwealth of Independent States, and later by the nationalistic assertion of countries in Central Europe, Central Asia, and the Balkans. The number of countries sitting in the United Nations has never been so high and could rise even in the coming years. There are many people around the world who fight, suffer and die in seeking their own state, currency and laws. Let us never forget how many Frenchmen have fought, have suffered and have died in order for us to have a state, a currency, a flag and our laws. Of course, in every region of the world, one or several dominant powers are tempted in reducing the neighboring nations to a state of dependency or even colonial rule. Of course, the powers that dominate the world intend to substitute the principles of sovereign nation with another set of logic and will work to destroy the institution founded on these principles, like UNESCO or the World Trade Organization, in order to replace them by organization it controls and where it imposes its laws. Of course, NGOs, foundations, investment funds and other non-governmental organizations act and pursue their purposes, or the purposes of the states behind them, beyond national borders. Of course, if globalization is outdated, no one will come back to previous state of things, but reach out for something else. There is no harm in admitting that. If countries choose so, they remain the masters and nations command. The financial elites only fuel their power because from the renunciation of the people and the betrayal of the representative, all too glad to become investment bankers. National politicians' passions rule in the beginning of the 20th century, and no one today would dare consider defending the 1990 nonsense regarding the planetary democracy, world governments, the standardization of laws and the suppression of states and borders. What do you want me to say? That I'm delighted? How could there be an international community without the respect between nations, which are equal in law, without abandoning the double standards which so often characterize the West, or those who claim to represent the West? The hopes that have emerged from the Pacific dissolution of the Soviet Union have not been realized. Too often, law has been used as a mark of the most brutal power relations, when it is not used as a means for new ways of colonization or submission, which are all the more dangerous as they are most scattered and progress masked behind fine principles and gentle feelings. I shall commit France to resolute activism within the international institutions so that we can build long-lasting peace through the constructive diversity and the sound confrontation of nations, national interests. I shall negotiate and cooperate on the basis of equal sovereign nations with mutual respect for each other. I will commit France in favor of a multipolar world based on the equal rights of all nations, their constant consultation and the respect of their independence. I will base my global strategy on the forgotten principles of the Havana Charter of 1948, which subordinated the economic freedoms, in particular freedom of trade, to social progress, full employment and reduction in poverty, to which I shall add environmental security and the defense of humanity's common heritage and goods. Human rights only find their fulfillment in pacified, confident, peaceful societies, which have their rights to and should be allowed to act against any aggression, whether it be environmental, financial, or moral. I want France to be the forerunner in deepening and enriching human rights policies by acting in favor of the rights of people in matters of environmental security, politics, religious and moral issues. I seek recognition of the right of people to self-determination in matters of religious faith, political regime, rights to citizenship, border control and migration. 2. The European Union, which, must I remind you, is not Europe, is against the tide of history. It is this institution which is responsible for delaying France on the global scene. The EU aspires to put an end to the nation-states. The EU claims to be ahead of the rest of the world. In reality, the EU is just outside the world as it really is. It took some time off from the rest of the world and stopped somewhere in the 1990s. Everywhere, the naive concept of globalization is falling apart, and everywhere individualism gives way to national preference. Everywhere, economic patriotism is triumphant, and everywhere, the legitimate need for protection requires the restoration of borders. The EU was supposed to prefigure globalization in Europe. With the end of its disappointing globalization, the EU is relegated to the museum of obsolete ideological constructions, while the Europe of the people that we stand for will take place in opposition to the dissolution of identity. And the European people are perfectly justified in not wanting to give up their identity. They have paid a heavy price for them. Those who in the east of Europe stood their ground for 2 generations while facing the overwhelming Soviet power teach us that maintaining one's identity is one of the most noble tasks of human intelligence, art and faith. This lesson will not be lost. The people had to put their political freedom in the hands of international institutions with strange acronyms, with unclear competences. Now they are taking back their freedom. I welcome the renaissance of the European people against a crooked EU, but in favor of Europe. They see how they are the only ones who are able to decide what's good for themselves, and whatever comes from the top or somewhere else, pretending to do good, but without their consent or against their interest, always seeks their submission. See how the WTO has failed. See the emptiness of the G20, and see how the European Union led to the decomposition of the European idea. It is time to end the so-called union, which in reality intended to destroy France, just as it intended to destroy Europe and the peoples and the nations, the only real Europe. In order to revitalize Europe, we need to put an end to the artificial construction which called itself European Union. We need to put bureaucratic monstrosity to an end in order to bring about new relationships of cooperation, so that the co-construction of the independent nations, which seek to stay independent, can triumph. This would put Europe at the forefront of a political order which would be peacefully combine universal and national values, and which yet has to be invented. For France, as for the United Kingdom, the European Union led to the withdrawal of the international responsibilities, which our respective history and strength, combined with our nuclear independence, conferred upon us. The European Union acts resolutely to cut off France from the Francophone countries, to separate France from the countries with which France has strong links, through the shared history, language and culture, which resulted in special, often passionate, but always rich links. The European Union has diminished France, especially by systematically substituting French organizations with international organizations. Regarding France, no other member of the EU has the strategic depth which makes this country present in the Pacific as well as in the Indian Ocean and in the Atlantic, just as well as in the Arctic and the Antarctic. No other member of the EU can consider the conduct of military operations abroad as France can. And France is one of the only 4 nations, with the United States, Russia and China, to know how to build aircraft carriers and nuclear submarines on our own. Whether it be on matters of homeland security or foreign operations, whether it be on controlling immigration or fiscal and social policies, the European Union isn't the solution, it's the problem. The design of this failed Europe is carried by Madame Merkel with incomprehensible stubbornness. She forces us, just like in 1757 when France under Louis XV had to face worrying attempts and pressure from Russia to undertake a switch of alliances. The choice we face is simple. Either the European Union, which is ideologically and economically ruled by Germany, accepts to negotiate, or France will find itself allies in all other free states of Europe to find other ways to organize the continent. Whether Madame Merkel, Mr. Schulz, or any illegitimate commissioner accepts it or not, we will build another Europe, the Europe that existed before the so-called European Union, and which will live on well beyond it. A Europe of nations, a Europe of which gave so many forms and symbols that still drive the world today. That is why the first task I will assign to my government will be to review the European treaties, our relationship with NATO, and to firmly commit France to the construction of a free Europe. Because France is the only continental power which sought to preserve an autonomous defence force, because she deposes of unpreceded strategic superiority in continental Europe, France has to take the initiative for a coordinated defence of the European nations with the 2 closest powers, the United States and Russia. No commitment can force France to abandon any aspect of her sovereignty can be held as irreversible. Whatever the people choose to delegate, share or hand over, the will of the people can take it back. Our Europe won't be the Europe of commissioners, but the Europe of free people. 3. The United States, which are everything what a nation should be, and that may have the temptation to go beyond that, the unavoidable nation, became both the indisputable long-term ally and sometimes, it must be said, sometimes in recent decades, almost an adversary on a daily basis. The triumph over communism, the temptation not to recognize other nations as equals, and sometimes the refusal to accept the idea of limits, may have led in the past to a strategic overheating and concerning expressions of force. This overheating, this drift, to which a strategic evolution initiated by Barack Obama had not put an end, worried us as allies as friends, and as nations attached to world peace. This strategic adventure of the United States may have led to damage to what we see as our vital interest: the destruction of Iraq, Syria, Libya, with the floods of millions of migrants, the creation of an instability in the Mediterranean area, the dangerous games with the Islamist militias, the strengthening of the Russian presence in the Mediterranean, the worries of Turkey. With the election of President Donald Trump, we hope to see a major inflection, almost a change of doctrine that will not only be positive for the world, but also be positive for the United States of America. I welcome his realism and his will for change. I wish to believe that the United States will break with the absurd idea of submitting its allies. To admit this logic of submission and to let it continue would be for the great American nation, as well as for us, the abdicating the idea of national independence. It would be to cut itself off from the rest of the world, a world in which authority and legitimacy of the Western Bloc has unfortunately been consistently reduced since the 2007-2008 crisis, September the 11th, the aggressions against Iraq, Libya and Syria. We do not hold it against the United States to assert, through the voice of its elected president, the primacy of defense of its national interests. This is natural, legitimate, and has the merit of being honest. We know his rule, we have admitted it, because we advocated for France and profess it for the nations of the world. We know that in the interest of France, we are required to pay attention to the defense of our own interests. Sometimes defending our interests will always try to find a just and durable solution in consultation with our partners. I firmly believe that sharing the same vision of the world puts us in the best position to find a path for just trade and diplomatic regulations, and that we will have to negotiate in the future with the United States. We have never confused the American people and their administrations, sometimes clumsy and sometimes indifferent, even hostile to our interests. But this alliance, commanded by history and security interest, decided by the French people, does not mean alignment, strategic dependence, or political submission. This is why the historical and emotional ties that bind us with the United States since the War of Independence will not prevent us from leaving the integrated command of NATO. NATO is continuously reducing France's strategic autonomy by bringing its industrialists back to the rank of subcontractors, subordinating their weapons to foreign-controlled standards, dictating alliances, embargoes and submissions that are neither in its own interests nor reflecting our own values. I would ask that the independence of our forces be restored in each strategic component of its defense, and particularly in the field of nuclear deterrence. This revision of our participation in NATO is all the more understandable because the new President of the United States has himself thought to reconsider the scope and the necessity of this military coalition, which could be seen somehow anachronistic today. There is no sign of defiance or hostility in our approach. It is the fundamental alliance between France and the American people. It is the freedom of the French nation which gives it meaning and significance. 5. Russia is no longer the Soviet Union. Russia remains a decisive actor in the balance of powers, which is the only path to pacify globalization. During the Second World War, she paid a heavy price. The 25 million Russians and other nationalities from the Soviet Empire have contributed so we could be free. No other nation paid a heavier price, and France will not forget, although the European Union urges us to do so. Russia was poorly treated by the European Union and by France, being a EU vassal state. We deplore the denial of our commitments when we yielded to foreign pressure and refused to deliver frigates, contrary to our commitments. Frigates which, in addition, would not have modified the strategic balance nor contributed to increasing tensions in Ukraine or the Baltic Sea. Russia returned to the Middle East, where she is now an essential partner. She has scored points on the international scene. It would be dangerous to tempt her into choosing between Europe and Asia. France must work to tie Russia to the European continent, because it is in the order of the world, and above all because it is in the interest of Europe. The Clinton administration betrayed the promises to Russia made during the perestroika. Explicit promises made by the Bush administration, including respect for a denuclearized area around Russia. Striving for independence of the European nations can only lead to a balance of power in a way that will guarantee to Russia its security and help to improve the living conditions of the Russian people. 6. Africa is at the heart of France's foreign policy. I think it's important to talk about it, and I am the only candidate in the French presidential election to do so. Firstly, because the nations of Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Maghreb and Madagascar have a special effective link with our country, a link that the vicissitudes of history or the years that separate us from independence have in no way altered, and I am delighted that. Secondly, because Africa is the continent which remains a traditional partner of France for its companies, its exchanges, its commercial outlets, and sharing a common tongue. Finally, because Africa, struggling with an outbreak of Islamic barbarism, is suffering with us the horrors of terrorism. It is normal that this continent finds in us a determined, active ally and, if necessary, a military presence, as is the case today in these countries like Mali, Cameroon and Chad. We want to break with the too often condescending policies that leads moralizing speeches and as has too often been in the case in the past. We will apply to our African partners the principle of non-interference. However, this non-interference should not be taken for indifference. We will end today's fluctuating relations and replace them with stable relations which will guarantee the states that so desire the security of legitimate powers. We want to put in place a policy based upon openness, mutual respect and active cooperation. We will be forced to put an end to mass immigration to France because our country can no longer bear this heavy financial burden. Immigration control will always be carried out in humane and dignified conditions. This new French policy will intervene in direct consultation and close cooperation with the countries of origin. Let me be clear, this new policy will not mean the end of exchanges and travels. African students will be welcome on the condition that they accept, which is of course also in the interest of their countries of origin, the principle of return to their homeland at the end of their studies. African and French entrepreneurs will be encouraged to deepen their technological, financial and commercial exchanges. French people of African descent are and will be considered as French in their own right, enjoying as such all the benefits attached to the French nationality and on our soil of the national priority for employment and housing. Nationals of African countries who live in France will be guaranteed, in the same way as the French and foreigners of France, a total legal and physical protection. To accompany the development of Africa, we will recreate a Ministry of Cooperation and devote the necessary funds to a great policy, in particular regarding primary education, agriculture and defence. The sixth item that I wish to develop concerns immaterial spaces, but they relate to international relations. I would like to add here a major point, which goes beyond the others by its importance. The independence of France is also played out and is perhaps mostly played on lands which are no longer those of classical affairs between states. The hyperpower is financial, it is digital, it is virtual. This field of action concerns, for example, the establishment of private international courts, which, on the cover of free trade, are intended to replace the justices of states. Legal warfare, war of religions, economic warfare, war of life, war of systems and algorithms. All these fields of power are abstract, but with tangible effects. Out of range for traditional diplomacy, but they must not escape our international policy. They are the fields on which the United States, Russia and China, or Islam, have undoubtedly scored points in the last decade. We do not have to suffer through ignorance, naivety or incompetence, as we have done too much in the area of food standards, patentability of life, personal data or accounting standards, legal compliance and financial systems. The European Union has paralyzed nations that were aware of this, nations that wanted to do something but did not share the same strategic horizon, the same proximity, and at the end neutralized each other. The result being that at 28, the Union is weaker than at 15 states, more irresolute than any single great nation that is trapped there. Just the same, diplomacy is subject to the power of image. We must measure the revolution of the collective consciousness realized by the permanent, universal, and instantaneous spectacle of the world to itself. A bombing in Aleppo, a refugee child on an Italian beach, flooding in Xinjiang, a bear in a Vermont pool, as well as a beached whale in Australia. We see, or we can see everything, anywhere, at any time, on any subject. The transmission of images and words makes the emotion irreversible. It allows all manipulations. It makes even more necessary than ever the collective debate and the affirmation of the national priorities and the choices of France. To see everything is not to understand everything. It is far from it. To know, to understand, to act wisely, we must innovate our relations with the world and with ourselves. I will ask the government, the French government, to work on building an innovative, open diplomacy based on the interests of France and the choice of the French people, so that every French woman, every French man feels himself or herself to be an ambassador of France in the world, representative of France in the world, and carries the image of France with him or her wherever he or she goes, whatever he or she does. No one represents or will ever represent France better than the French. To do this, we must inform, explain, consult, debate and act. A rescaling of the diplomatic network, information and influence is necessary, and particularly to deploy it further on the new fields of power, tensions and breaking points. Strengthening ties with the economic and cultural world will allow us to conduct a modern diplomacy, that is to say, active throughout the scope of influence, cooperation and international negotiation. An economic diplomacy, legal, ecological, cultural and humanitarian diplomacy. We have the means of our ambition. We must act and coordinate them within the framework of a global strategy. Brexit Britain gives us the example of political freedom. Facing the now inevitable collapse of the European Union, challenged on all sides, in front of the planned breakup of the Eurozone by the near inevitable departure, at least, of Italy, France has the means to anticipate the situation and to act. It is not condemned to suffer. France is amongst the very few countries in the world that have a truly global diplomatic and information network, the capacity to know, to understand and to act. We have to update, redeploy and activate it. A short-sighted management policy made us close our foreign missions, reduce the French presence and abandon local functions. We know less today about the system of power in Russia than we used to know about the apparatus of the Soviet Communist Party. Despite many centuries of history, confrontations and complicated but constant proximity, we have not been able to develop an informed intelligence facing the rise of Wahhabi Islam and the outbreak of the conflict between Shiites and Sunnis. Our academic and intelligence capabilities have been reduced, and the very legacy of French diplomacy has been wasted. I will restore them. The security of France, the influence of France, the power of France are no longer the business of a few in palaces, agencies or embassies. It's everyone's business. It is the way it used to be and the way it should become again. We shall involve the French people in the international action of their country. I consider it an integral part of the presidential mission to share with the population the opinion that France had about the state of the world, to assemble them around the objectives that France pursues, and to mobilize all citizens, investors, entrepreneurs, as well as diplomats and soldiers for the sake of actions that France is leading to achieve its objectives and to ensure the freedom of the French people. This mission has not been accomplished for a long time. Was there ever a national policy to explain to our compatriots or an international strategy to share with them? Twice a year, or on occasions I will choose, I shall come and explain to the French people the policy of France in the world, with results obtained and objectives pursued. France has interests, has principles, and its policy follows a global strategy of international relations. It must be said, we must make it known, and above all ensure that the French share the same elements of analysis and conviction. Their adhesion is the condition of the success of the policy I intend to carry out, in the service of the greater France and of all the French. The French were amongst the discoverers of the world. There is no port, bush, desert, nor lost island or deep jungle where the French have not explored, worked, cleared, and carried our country. France is present in all the countries of the world. And how many French know that its longest land boundary links it to Brazil and to the south of Guyana? How many Frenchmen know that Brazil has borrowed its motto to a Frenchman, Auguste Comte? How many have lived a respectful emotion that seizes so many Moroccans in the memory of Lyautey? How many consider the traces left in Africa by the cry of Frantz Fanon, the songs of Léopold Senghor, or the alerts of René Dumont? And how many remember the sentence of Secretary General of the United Nations, Boutros Boutros-Ghali? Anywhere in the world, French is the language of the non-aligned. The world was their adventure, the adventure of all the French, because it was France and because it was them. I quote names and references that may surprise you. It is because the idea, France, I take all that made it great, made it loved, made it preferred, from Claude Lévi-Strauss to Auguste Comte, and from Ferdinand de Lesseps to Médecins Sans Frontières, from Pasteur to Maurice Allais. I refuse to choose among all those who made France great in the world and for the world, among all those who carried France to the world. They have labored, created, invented in the name of France. They have represented to the world a piece of France. They are ours. No matter their origins, their opinions, and their commitments, they have made our country grow, and that's all I want to remember. This is also what fraternity is about, the greatness, the generosity of France. And it is because I claim all the heritage of the French patriots that I will restore for my fellow countrymen and women the pride in France, of what they are and what they can do. France has no right to disappoint. France has no right to surrender. France must rediscover the world. France must reconnect with the only true universalism, which is patriotism, national singularities, and political freedom. The French have allowed this legacy to be lost because they have allowed themselves to believe propaganda for too long. If one says the world is flat, why try to understand it further? If all men are alike, why would they like to meet and to be curious about each other? If the world is promised for global democracy and world government expert committees, why learn history? If origins, cultures, religions no longer count for anything, why focus on understanding? Why be curious? I fear the violence that will respond, which already responds to the uniformity of images, products and trade against which France has so often and so passionately stood against, and against whom France, her protective labels, its cultural exception, have so often won. France, with all free nations, with all free people, will be able to struggle against the crushing of the world that these monstrous allies, namely moral and financial liberalism, imposed, multiculturalism and extension of commodification, as well as the absolute individualism and the all-powerful conformity. When citizenship is sold, when law enters competition, when the items that are bought and sold pretend to put an end to things that are priceless, in any language of the world, the harvest of violence lifts, and then the boundary, the separation, the delightful singularities that make the other and the us, that make the trust and the rest with its own, become again the guardians of peaceful universe that have always been. The French people know that their foremost common good is France, its borders, its singularity and strong personality. As their nation, her borders and her personality are of foremost importance to all the free people in Europe and in the world. We live in a world of disillusionment, of broken dreams. What this sentiment calls for is simple, simpler than the confusion of propaganda and manipulation of public emotion. It is the return of true politics. What I mean by politics, the noble sense of the word, is the freedom of people to choose their destiny. I believe that their political liberty is the most precious possession of the French, the only one, perhaps, which for each of us is worth more than life. And it is the primary possession of the people, anywhere in the world, and the most universal. Look at decolonization. Look at the end of empires and the triumph of the nation-states. Look at how Brexit, the election of Trump, and the rise of Europe against the so-called European Union that stifles it, open the 21st century with an insurrection of people. The present movement of return of politics is the result of a perpetual force, the interest of the nations, the quest of freedom. It is simple because it is the inevitable result of the aggressions, provocations and humiliations that globalization caused to proud people who are now determined to remain the way they are. The movement is simple, yet its consequences are complex. The insurrection of difference, the revolt of free people has begun. It grows up in France and it grows up in the world, with the French men and women, in the name of the French people, will bring it to the only victory that counts, freedom. With them, we will work for the respect of all peoples, for dialogue amongst all nations. Together, for peace in the world, we will make France great again. Long live the Republic, long live France.